It was a quiet Sunday morning in the summer of 1997 when Pastor Elijah Moore delivered his final sermon. The congregation remembers his voice that day, soothing, resolute, as if he knew something they didn't. He spoke of sacrifice, of listening when God calls even in silence. Hours later, he vanished without a trace. No goodbye, no note, just the fading echo of his words and an empty chair where he always sat. For more than 2 decades, his disappearance became both wound and whisper through. The small town of Hollow Creek never stopped wondering. Some believed he ran away. Others claimed foul play. A few, more hopeful, insisted he had been taken for a purpose, a divine calling that couldn't be understood. But as the years passed and the world moved on, the memory of Pastor Moore faded into something less than fact and more like a ghost. A story told in hushed tones during storms or at funerals when faith felt fragile. Then came the carving. A hiker, exploring the woods miles beyond the town's border, stumbled upon something carved deep into the trunk of a towering cedar. The bark had aged around the letters, but the name was clear: Elijah Moore. No dates, no message, just his name, alone, etched with deliberate hands into living wood. The tree itself had been untouched by fire, storm, or axe, as if it had been guarding something all this time. And the chilling part, experts estimated the carving had been made 26 years earlier. Suddenly, the past no longer felt distant. Questions flooded back with renewed urgency. Why that tree? Who carved it? And if it truly was Elijah himself, what message had he left behind? The forest, silent for so long, now whispered again. And those who had long stopped searching found themselves drawn back to a mystery that had never really been solved. Only paused. This isn't just the story of a man who went missing. It's about the echoes we leave behind, the truths we carve not into stone, but into memory, into nature, into the things that stand long after we're gone. Because sometimes it's not the disappearance that haunts us most, but the return of a name when no one is listening for it anymore. The disappearance of Pastor Elijah Moore shook the small congregation of Hollow Creek to its core. He had been more than a spiritual leader. He was the town's compass. The kind of man who remembered every birthday, visited every hospital room, and never missed a single Sunday at the pulpit. That morning in 1997, everything seemed normal. He greeted everyone at the door with his usual warm smile, delivered a sermon about listening when God speaks in unexpected ways, and left the chapel. The town sheriff at the time, Richard Halberd, launched a search that extended over miles of dense woodland. Volunteers combed through trails, police dogs tracked scents that vanished near the riverbank, and helicopters scanned the canopy from above. But there were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no vehicle found. It was as if Elijah had walked straight into the trees and become part of them. His Bible, still marked with sermon notes, was found on the passenger seat of his unlocked car. That only. In the weeks that followed, his absence became a presence of its own. People began to say the chapel felt colder, quieter, as if something sacred had gone missing with him. Some said they dreamt of him, always standing at the edge of the woods, saying nothing, just looking back. Others, more skeptical, believed he'd simply walked away from a life of service that had become too heavy. But no one who knew Elijah believed that. Not really. His wife, Miriam, refused to leave the town. If he's out there, she would say every morning on her porch, he's not gone. He's waiting to be found. For years, she kept his clothes folded, his study untouched, his seat beside her at church unclaimed. Her grief wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, constant, the kind that lingers in the space someone used to fill. Every anniversary of his disappearance, the townspeople gathered for a candlelight vigil in the chapel, reading his favorite verses, singing the H. Then, as time wore on, the town began to change. Children grew up not remembering Elijah's voice. Newcomers arrived, unaware of his legacy. The chapel grew older. Miriam passed away in her sleep 19 years after her husband vanished, clutching the last photo they took together. She never stopped believing he would return, and for a long time, it seemed her faith would be the last voice still calling his name into the trees. But then came the discovery that would awaken everything that Hollow Creek had buried beneath time and sorrow. A young man named Jacob Morrow, a photographer from out of town, had been hiking the Ridgepath Trail, an unmarked route that veered far from the official maps. He was searching for old-growth trees to photograph for a wilderness exhibit. What he found instead stopped him cold. A massive cedar, gnarled and ancient, standing alone in a clearing as if it had grown in sacred isolation. And carved a. Jacob snapped a photo. The name was unmistakable. Not a coincidence. Not a common name. The letters were deliberate, clean despite the age of the bark. Elijah Moore. It didn't feel like graffiti. It felt like a message. Or a signature. Jacob uploaded the image to his blog later that night, never imagining the storm it would unleash. Within hours, locals from Hollow Creek began commenting. By morning, the sheriff's department had reopened the case. Experts brought in to study the carving determined the age of the inscription through botanical analysis. The tree had healed around the edges of the letters in a way consistent with carvings made approximately 26 years earlier, placing the mark within months of Elijah's disappearance. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a timeline, and it begged a terrifying, wondrous question. Did Elijah carve it himself? The location of the tree raised even more questions. It was miles from where the original search teams had focused. The area had been considered too remote, too dangerous to explore during the initial investigation. And yet there it stood, undisturbed, surrounded by thick underbrush, as if nature itself had protected the secret all this time. No other markings, no campsites, no remains, just a single name, etched in a living wood. The town was split. Some believed Elijah had gone into the forest willingly, as part of some spiritual pilgrimage. Others feared he had been running from something, or someone. A few whispered of a vision quest, citing his final sermon that Sunday morning. When the voice comes, don't question it. Just follow. Had he heard something that morning? Something no one else had? Whatever the answer, it now lay somewhere beyond that cedar, in a silence that had waited more than 2 decades to speak again. As word spread of the tree carving, pilgrims began arriving in Hollow Creek. Some were journalists hungry for human mystery. Others were spiritual seekers, convinced Elijah had discovered something transcendent in the woods. A few were simply curious, eager to see with their own eyes the cedar that had held a man's name like a secret prayer for over 2 decades. The once sleepy town found itself on maps again, and for the first time in years, the chapel overflowed with people carrying more questions to each. Sheriff Halberd, long retired, returned to the department in a volunteer capacity to consult on the reopened case. He was older now, his gait slower, but his memory sharp. He remembered every lead, every blind trail, every unanswered call. Standing before the photograph of the tree, he whispered, "I should have looked farther. I should have listened closer." That night, he walked the edge of the forest himself, flashlight in hand, as if hoping to hear something he missed 26 years ago. Meanwhile, the team investigating the site found something buried at the base of the cedar. It wasn't bones or fabric, but something far more intimate, a rusted wedding band with the initials E+M engraved on the inside. Miriam and Elijah. The band was old, weathered, but intact. Its presence confirmed a chilling truth. Elijah had been there, and whatever happened afterward, he had either returned willingly to the earth or never left. The find ignited a wave of emotion throughout Hollow Creek. Old churchgoers wept openly in the chapel. Some felt comforted by the idea that Elijah had carved his name and laid his ring beneath the roots as a final testament. Others were disturbed, haunted by the notion that he might have died there, alone, waiting. The pastor they had leaned on for comfort had left behind a question that comfort could not answer. Why? And yet, there was something sacred in the discovery. Not sensational. Sacred. As if the forest had waited until the right moment to speak. Not when people were searching blindly, but when they were ready to listen differently. Not with urgency, but with reverence. The tree had become a monument, not to a death, but to a decision. And that decision, whatever it was, would draw them deeper into a story that was no longer just about Elijah. It was about all of them. Jacob, the hiker who had found the tree, returned to Hollow Creek a second time, this time not as a photographer, but as a man unsettled. He confessed to Lucia, the current pastor of the chapel, that he hadn't slept well since taking the photo. "I feel like I interrupted something," he said, "like I opened a door that was supposed to stay closed." Lucia, a thoughtful woman with quiet wisdom, replied gently, "Or maybe you opened one that was finally ready." The town council authorized a careful excavation of the surrounding forest, led by environmental experts and forensic consultants, not to find a body, but to find meaning. And what they discovered was both remarkable and strange. Small symbols, carved faintly into other nearby trees, crosses, arrows, even verses from Scripture. They were subtle, easily overlooked, but together they formed a trail, a map, a path that Elijah might have walked, step by step, deeper into the unknown. Each marking corresponded to moments in his past sermons. Phrases that had once seemed metaphorical now appeared literal. He leadeth me beside still waters. Into the wilderness, he calls the willing. Let your roots go deep, and the storm will not break you. These weren't just poetic lines. They were breadcrumbs, left behind not for escape, but for someone, someday, to follow. Lucia organized a group to walk the trail, reading aloud each verse as they went, moving with care and reverence. Some cried, others sang softly, and at the trail's end, near a ridge that overlooked the valley, they found a small wooden cross, weathered but upright, pressed into the soil. Nailed to its center was a page from a Bible, protected in a plastic sleeve. Psalm 91. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. There was no name, no bones, no message, only that verse, chosen with intention. It was the same psalm Elijah had once read at the funeral of a child lost too soon. Perhaps this was his resting place. Perhaps it was just another stop along a longer journey. But whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Elijah hadn't vanished. He had walked into a calling few could understand. And now, those he left behind were beginning to trace his path, not with fear, but with wonder. News of the trail and the verses spread quickly, drawing more than just former parishioners and townspeople. Scholars, theologians, and even survivalists came to Hollow Creek to study Elijah's markings. Some saw them as a spiritual pilgrimage, others as a coded message. But all agreed on one thing: nothing about the path felt random. Every symbol, every verse, every tree carved with care suggested purpose. A man not fleeing chaos, but walking with conviction into something greater. Among the visitors was a professor of religious anthropology, Dr. Marcus Ellis, who had spent decades researching desert mystics and spiritual wanderers. After walking the trail, he declared Elijah's journey one of the most poetic acts of embodied theology ever witnessed. He argued that Elijah didn't go missing. He went intentional, not to disappear, but to live out a gospel unfiltered by walls, pews, or sermons. This was his final message, Ellis said, and he wrote in roots, leaves, and light. For the people of Hollow Creek, this theory challenged everything. If Elijah had chosen solitude, had followed a divine whisper into the wild, what did that say about the life he left behind? About Miriam, about the congregation, about the church he built with his hands? Some wrestled with feelings of abandonment. Others began to reframe their grief, realizing perhaps Elijah had not abandoned them, but had trusted them to carry on, knowing his final journey wasn't meant to be shared. Not then. Lucia, now deeply involved in piecing together Elijah's path, uncovered more of his old writings in the church's storage. Sermon drafts, letters never sent, reflections never preached. In one he wrote, "If ever I leave without a goodbye, know that it was never goodbye. It was a going deeper." Those words, once confusing, now felt prophetic. It was as if Elijah had been preparing everyone, quietly, tenderly, for a departure only he understood. And so, what began as a search for a missing man had turned into something much more layered. It had become a meditation on calling, sacrifice, and the distance between duty and destiny. Elijah's presence, once feared lost, now felt imprinted on every tree, every prayer, every pause in the wind. The question shifted from where did he go to what did he find? And that question would become the heartbeat of everything that followed. As spring returned to Hollow Creek, the forest trail began to transform. The once wild path became a sacred route, walked not for spectacle, but for silence. People removed their shoes. Some brought candles. Others left small notes tucked into branches. Prayers, confessions, names of loved ones lost. It wasn't tourism. It was pilgrimage. Each step a question, each clearing a pause. And at the end, the cedar with his name stood like a sentinel, alive, unchanged, watching. One morning, a boy named Caleb, no older than 11, left a letter at the base of the cedar. He had lost his father the year before and had heard Elijah's story from his grandmother. The letter, written in shaky pencil, read, "If you see my dad, tell him I'm still praying. Tell him I'm okay. Tell him thank you." That letter was never removed. The forest claimed it, and somehow, everyone who saw it felt it had reached where it needed to go. Lucia, reflecting on all that had unfolded, began writing a book, not a biography, but a spiritual reflection titled The Trail He Left. In it, she explored how Elijah's journey mirrored those of prophets, mystics, and saints who walked away from the world not to reject it, but to understand it more fully. She wrote, "He carved his name into a tree, but he wrote his truth into us." Her manuscript was raw, reverent, and soon translated into 5 languages. Despite all the wonder and beauty, not everyone embraced the mystery. A few old townsfolk still believed there was more to the story, that Elijah had been hurt, that someone knew more than they were saying. An anonymous letter even surfaced to the sheriff's office, claiming to have seen a figure in white the night Elijah vanished. But no evidence ever emerged. And with time, suspicion softened, not into certainty, but into surrender. Because sometimes, answers aren't solutions. Sometimes, they're invitations. Elijah's journey didn't promise clarity. It offered something braver, presence, a willingness to walk into the unknown and trust that purpose would meet him there. And now, years later, those who followed his trail weren't just finding Elijah. They were finding parts of themselves he had somehow known they would need to uncover too. The deeper people explore Elijah's path, the more they began to understand that it wasn't just about where he had gone. It was about what he had become. He had always been a man of deep conviction, someone who could stand in silence longer than most could speak, who believed that truth wasn't always found in answers, but in endurance. His sermons were not performances, they were offerings. And his final act, walking alone into the forest, now felt less like disappearance and more like devotion. Among those most impacted was a woman named Ruthie Hayes, once a child in Elijah's congregation, now a social worker in a neighboring city. After visiting the trail, she confessed to Lucia that for years she'd struggled with belief, especially after the death of her sister. But walking the path Elijah had carved changed something in her. "It didn't give me faith," she said. "It gave me permission to question, to hurt, and still keep going." That distinction resonated deeply with many. Back in the chapel, the community began integrating Elijah's trail into their spiritual rhythm. On the last Sunday of each month, they held the walk, a reflective procession from the church steps to the cedar tree and back. No one preached. No one led. They just walked, together, in silence. Children held the hands of elders. Strangers walked beside longtime friends. And along the way, people left things behind, stones with words etched in them. Hope, grace, listen, stay. The forest became a script. Then came the unexpected discovery that deepened the mystery even further. Beneath a fallen tree not far from the cedar, a volunteer found a small, hand-sewn pouch wrapped in wax cloth. Inside it was a compass, its needle stuck, and a single page torn from a devotional journal. On it, Elijah had written one sentence: "God does not always send storms to test our strength. Sometimes he sends stillness to test our listening." The ink had faded, but the weight of the message had not. That phrase became etched into the wooden sign, now posted near the trail's beginning. Not to explain, not to instruct, just to invite. Because Elijah Moore, in all his quiet mystery, hadn't asked to be remembered as a man who vanished, but as one who followed the voice only he could hear, leaving behind not confusion, but a path for those brave enough to walk where certainty ends and wonder begins. Years after the tree carving was discovered, Hollow Creek no longer referred to Elijah's absence as a tragedy. They called it the Crossing, a name born not of myth, but of reverence. The chapel's stained glass window was redone in his honor, not with his face, but with a depiction of a forest bathed in golden light and a single figure walking toward it. The artist included no destination, only movement, because Elijah's journey had become less about where he went and more about why he left. Lucia, standing before the window one evening after service, reflected on how far they had all come. What began as a loss had evolved into a liturgy of remembrance, not one weighed down by sorrow, but lifted by meaning. He taught us more by leaving, she once said, than many do by staying. And in that paradox, there was healing, not the erasure of grief, but the transformation of it into legacy. Among the younger generation, Elijah had become almost a mythic figure, not for the mystery, but for the message. Teenagers started reading his old sermons in youth groups. Some even chose to be baptized at the trail's end, where the land overlooked the valley, sunlight breaking through the canopy like a benediction. One girl, barely 16, whispered before being immersed, "This is where I heard him." No one needed to ask who him was. They already knew. The original cedar tree, now protected by the local government, became known as the Witness. Botanists tended to it, ensuring its health. Visitors often left behind letters, folded tightly and tied to nearby branches with strands of cloth. The wind carried whispers through those offerings, as if the forest itself had become a living cathedral, echoing the prayers of the present and the presence of a man who once walked alone with only faith as his guide. And still, the forest speaks, not in voices, not in signs, but in the stillness between footfalls, in the hush before the birds sing, in the space where one name, Elijah, remains not as an echo of disappearance, but as a call to listen deeply, walk gently, and trust that not all who vanish are lost. Some are simply ahead of us, carving the way through mystery. Elijah's journey began to inspire not only those who visited Hollow Creek, but countless others around the world who encountered his story through articles, documentaries, and word of mouth. In a remote chapel in Norway, a candle was lit beneath a tree-shaped sculpture in his name. In a village in the Philippines, a young pastor gave a sermon titled "When the Shepherd Walks First," referencing Elijah's mysterious walk into the woods. It was as if his message, etched in wood, sealed in silence, had found voice. Back in Hollow Creek, an old tape was discovered in a dusty box behind the chapel's organ. It was unmarked except for a handwritten label, "Final Reflections." The recording, crackling with age, revealed Elijah's voice, soft, clear, and hauntingly peaceful. In it, he spoke not of fear or escape, but of surrender. "There's a place," he said, "where the road ends and the presence begins, where a man must stop preaching and start becoming. I think I'm ready to meet God without a pulpit between us." Iwa. The tape became sacred. Not relic, not doctrine, just presence. It played on repeat some days in the chapel, not loudly, but just enough to be felt. Visitors sat in pews, heads bowed, tears slipping silently down their cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of connection. Elijah was no longer just remembered. He was recognized, as if hearing his voice confirmed what many had begun to believe. He never truly left. He simply stepped into the stillness ahead of them. A young man named Isaiah, who had once struggled with addiction and spent years in isolation, credited Elijah's story with saving his life. "He taught me that I didn't have to be loud to be strong, that stepping away wasn't weakness, it was sacred." Isaiah now worked as a counselor, using parts of the trail he left in his recovery sessions. For him and many others, Elijah had become a symbol not of loss, but of return, of finding yourself on the other side of silence. And so, Hollow Creek was no longer the town where a pastor went missing. It became the town where a path was born, a path that keeps being walked, not because it leads to an answer, but because it reminds us that some truths are not meant to be solved, but carried. Elijah didn't leave a doctrine. He left a direction, and the world, it seemed, was finally learning to follow. In the 50th year of the chapel's founding, a commemorative service was held, not just for the building, but for the man who had first filled it with light. There were no eulogies, no speeches, just stories. One by one, people stood and spoke not of Elijah's disappearance, but of his presence in their lives. A woman shared how his quiet counsel kept her from ending her marriage. A farmer recalled how Elijah once walked 10 miles in the snow to deliver a single verse to his dying father. Every story was. As the service ended, Lucia stepped forward holding a simple wooden box. Inside it was the original compass found near the cedar, now restored and framed beneath glass. She placed it on the altar and said, "This compass may never point north again, but it always points inward, just like he did." The room stood in silence, not for mourning, but for gratitude. It was a silence so full, so alive, that it needed no prayer to sanctify it. Outside, lanterns were released into the twilight, each one carrying a message written by a member of the congregation. Words like guide, return, stillness, walk. As they floated upward, one candle escaped early, drifting just above the chapel roof. A child pointed and whispered, "That one's his." No one corrected her. No one needed to. That night, Lucia wrote in her journal, "He did not disappear. He dissolved into the path beneath our feet, into the silence we feared, into the answers we find when we stop asking." And those words, humble and true, were engraved the following week on a bench overlooking the start of Elijah's trail. Visitors now sit there quietly, often without saying a word, just breathing, just listening, because sometimes the most powerful sermons are the ones never spoken aloud. Sometimes they are carved in bark, left in rings beneath trees, and whispered through leaves by a man who walked into the unknown not to be found, but to leave behind a way for the rest of us to begin. As the seasons passed, the trail Elijah left behind became more than a path through the woods. It became a spiritual rite of passage. Retreat groups came quietly, walking barefoot through the soft earth, letting the forest teach them what no sermon ever could. Veterans processing trauma, couples trying to heal, seekers of peace, all of them came not to learn about Elijah, but to walk with him in some unseen way. There was no monument, no shrine, just space. And in that space, people rediscovered there. One autumn, a group of seminary students visited Hollow Creek as part of a course on modern mysticism. Their professor, skeptical of the hype, changed his view after the walk. "There's something here," he admitted, "something that breathes without speaking." He later wrote in his notebook, he carved his name into a tree, not to be remembered, but to remind us we're still writing ours. That line would echo throughout theological circles for years. Back in the town, Lucia continued to care for the chapel, now more of a spiritual home than a religious institution. People of all backgrounds came, believers, doubters, wanderers, and all were received the same way, with quiet, open arms. There was no pressure to belong, no expectation to explain. They simply sat in the stillness that Elijah had made sacred. And often, the only sound was the creak of old wood or the breath of wind brushing through the open windows. One visitor, an elderly man with shaking hands, placed a folded note at the foot of the pulpit and whispered, "Thank you for going first." No one asked what the note said. No one moved to remove it. They understood, because Elijah had become something deeply personal to each person. Not a figure to be worshipped, but a reminder to be followed. Not in footsteps, but in posture, in trust, in the audacity to leave without needing to arrive. And though many still wondered what had happened in those first days, where he slept, what he ate, whether he ever intended to return, the questions no longer demanded answers. Elijah had not written his story in ink. He had written it in silence, and that silence now spoke in 100 different ways to 1,000 different hearts. That winter, snow blanketed the trail, silencing even the crunch of footsteps. Still, visitors came, wrapped in scarves and thick coats, walking slower now, leaning into the cold. And somehow, even in the stillness of frost and bare trees, the trail felt alive. Some said it was the way the light hit the carving on the cedar, or how the wind carried birdsong in brief, broken notes. Others said it was Elijah, still there, still guiding. A child visiting with her parents stopped mid-trail and pointed to the sky. "It's the same shape as his compass," she said, tracing the curve of a hawk's flight. Her father looked up and saw only clouds, but he smiled anyway, because that's how the trail worked now. You didn't always see what others saw, but you felt what they felt. Elijah had shown them that some truths are not meant to be proven. They are meant to be believed into. A poem appeared on the chapel's front door one morning, tacked gently with twine. It was unsigned, its paper soft from weather, but its words struck deeply. I walked your path not to find you, but to find what you gave up. And somewhere in the letting go, I found my own return. Lucia read it aloud during the next gathering. No one knew who wrote it, but everyone felt like they had. Later that year, a bench was placed at the ridge where the final cross still stood. On its backrest, a small inscription: "Sit, breathe, listen." That was all. And visitors began doing just that, sitting in silence as mist curled over the hills, as birds dipped and soared above the treetops, as time slowed. Elijah had not built a monument, but he had built a pause, a place where the noise of the world stepped aside and something eternal whispered through the wind. And through it all, the forest remained unchanged. The trees still stood. The trail still wound its way through sacred quiet. And Elijah's name, carved once and never again, remained like a single breath held by the earth itself. Not gone, not even lost, just still walking. As spring returned to Hollow Creek once more, so did the flowers along Elijah's trail: wild violets, white trilliums, soft moss spreading like velvet across old roots. It was as if nature itself remembered him, marking his path not with headstones or marble, but with quiet resurrection. Every blossom, every petal unfolding, felt like a page turning in a story that hadn't truly ended, only paused between seasons. Lucia often visited the trail early in the morning, before the visitors arrived. She walked slowly, not with grief, but with gratitude. Sometimes she spoke to Elijah aloud, as if he were just ahead, listening as always. "You taught us," she'd say, "not with lessons, but with footsteps." She had stopped trying to define what had happened to him. What mattered now was what remained, what lived because of him. One morning, she noticed something new at the base of the cedar tree. A string of tiny wooden crosses, hand-carved and tied together with twine, hung gently from a low branch. Each cross bore a single name, initials etched with care. Not just Elijah's, but dozens of others. Names of loved ones, lost ones, forgotten ones. It was no longer just his tree. It had become theirs, a living altar of memory. A letter arrived that month from a prison in North Carolina. An inmate named Darnell had read about Elijah's story in a donated book. In his letter, he wrote, "I've never known freedom, but I think Elijah did. Not the kind behind gates, but the kind that walks into the unknown and trusts God anyway. He made me believe I could walk too, even if it's only inside myself." That letter now rests in a frame on the chapel's back wall. Elijah's journey, once thought to be about vanishing, was now understood as an invitation to walk, to trust, to listen, to release. His absence had not created emptiness. It had created space. And in that space, countless souls had begun to breathe again, to let go of needing all the answers, to start asking different questions. As the years passed, the trail remained, not polished, not paved, but present. The cedar tree aged, its bark thickening around the carved name like skin protecting a sacred wound. Botanists said it might live another 100 years. The townspeople smiled at that. "So will his story," they always replied. And deep down, they knew it was true. Because stories like Elijah's don't fade. They root. The chapel created a small book for visitors, a collection of testimonies from those who walked the trail. Some wrote only a sentence. Others filled pages. One entry read, "I came here to find peace. I left knowing peace had found me first." Another said, "He didn't disappear. He arrived where we were still afraid to go." Over time, the book grew thick with handwritten truths, raw, sacred, deeply human. Lucia, now older and walking with a cane, continued to speak of Elijah not in past tense, but in rhythm. "He is," she would say, "still teaching us." And indeed, every choice the town made, every decision to pause, to listen, to lead with grace, seemed to echo with a man who had once stood behind a pulpit, then stepped beyond it, into the forest, and into history. At sunset one evening, a teenager stood alone at the trail's end, tears slipping quietly down his face. When asked later what he had seen, he didn't describe a vision or miracle. He simply said, "I felt like I was being told to keep going." And that was enough. That was everything. Because Elijah's message, carved once into a tree, now echoed in hearts. You don't need to be found to be followed. You don't need to speak to be heard. And so, the forest remains. Quiet, steady, alive with something deeper than explanation. Elijah Moore's name is still there, etched in cedar and soul, not asking for remembrance, but offering something far more enduring, direction. And in the soft light of evening, as wind brushes through the leaves, it almost sounds like a whisper, walk on. As the 50th anniversary of Elijah's last sermon approached, Hollow Creek prepared, not for a spectacle, but for a remembrance. No fanfare, no cameras, just community. The plan was simple: a sunrise walk, a silent vigil, and a reading of Elijah's final sermon, the one he gave before vanishing into the trees. But this time, it would be read not from the pulpit, but at the base of the cedar tree, where his name had waited quietly for half a century. People traveled from across the country. Some brought photos of loved ones. Others brought letters, journals, small stones engraved with verses. No one was there to solve the mystery. They were there to honor it, to walk beside it. Because by now, they understood, Elijah's absence had revealed something far more profound than his presence ever could. It had made them listen, not just to stories, but to silence, to the divine hush that waits behind all our questions. The morning of the vigil arrived quiet and cold. Fog rolled in through the trees like breath. As the first light broke over the horizon, Lucia, now walking slowly with the help of two young congregants, stepped to the tree, opened a small leather-bound notebook, and began reading his final words. When you no longer hear my voice, don't assume I've gone. Ask instead what I left behind. And when the path grows quiet, know that is when I am closest. Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from weight. As she finished, the entire crowd stood in stillness. No one clapped. No one moved. Children held their parents' hands. Elders closed their eyes. And for a long moment, time itself seemed to fold. Then, gently, the wind stirred the canopy above, and the trees gave their answer, not in words, but in a rustling that sounded eerily like breath, like a voice still speaking. And someone whispered, "He's still here," not as myth, not as memory, but as meaning. And from that moment on, no one ever spoke of Elijah Moore as the man who disappeared. He was now known, across the town and beyond, as the one who walked first, a guide not only through the woods, but through doubt, through silence, through surrender. And as his name remained carved in that ancient cedar, so too did his message remain carved in hearts. Walk slowly, walk honestly, and trust that even when no one sees your path, it matters. The chapel, long ago built by Elijah's hands, had weathered storms, decay, even near abandonment. Yet it stood stronger than ever, restored, not by nails or wood, but by what it had come to mean. People no longer gathered there simply for services. They came to recalibrate, to grieve, to begin again. And always, always, they left quieter than they arrived. Not burdened, anchored. At the far end of the sanctuary, a small alcove had been turned into a quiet room. No signs, no formal dedication. Just a chair facing a stained glass image of a tree and a trail. People entered alone, sat as long as they needed, then left with something less definable than peace, but more lasting. The sisters called it Elijah's silence. It was not an absence of sound, but the presence of meaning too deep to name. On the anniversary's final evening, Lucia returned to the cedar alone. She pressed her hand to the bark, to the name. "You never came back," she said softly, "because you never left." She closed her eyes, letting the stillness wrap around her like a cloak. The moonlight danced between branches. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then was silent. And Lucia knew, with a peace too strong to question, that Elijah had reached what he was seeking, and in doing so, had taught them all how to seek. Weeks later, a child visiting with her family would ask a simple question: "Can I write my name too?" And so, a second tree was chosen nearby, not to replace Elijah's, but to continue his invitation. One by one, Visitors began adding their names, not to be seen, but to remember that they too were walking a path that mattered. And as each name joined the bark, the forest became a library of lives, stories woven in grain and root, in reverence and breath. And so, Elijah Moore became not a mystery, not a ghost, not even a man who vanished. He became a voice in the quiet, a compass that never pointed to place, but to purpose. And in the hush of Hollow Creek, where wind hums and trees bend in prayer, that voice remains, inviting every traveler to step forward in faith, to walk with reverence, and to believe, even in the stillness, that they are never walking alone. The new tree, now affectionately called the Pilgrim Cedar, began to fill slowly with names. Some were written in soft pencil, others carved carefully with pocket knives. A few were just initials or symbols, a star, a heart, a single cross. There were no rules, no ceremonies, just one unspoken understanding. To write your name was to admit you were walking something invisible, something difficult, something holy, and that you had chosen not to turn back. Teenagers came at night, not to vandalize, but to sit in circles around the trailhead and talk in whispers. They spoke of pain, of doubt, of wanting to run. But every time they looked toward the cedar and saw Elijah's name beside theirs, something anchored them. If he could keep walking, one boy said, then maybe so can I. What had once been a pastor's path was now becoming a generation's inheritance. Not a tradition, but a trust. One morning, after a heavy rain, a visitor from Canada left a small bottle of earth beside the tree. It held soil from her father's grave, a pastor who had taken his own life during a time of deep personal despair. She left a note, folded beneath a rock, that read, Elijah, thank you for staying long enough to teach the rest of us how to leave differently. Lucia read it with trembling hands, her heart pulled between ache and awe. Some stories, she knew, were too heavy for pulpits, but never too heavy for tiara. That spring, the trail was renamed Elijah's Way, not by ordinance or decree, but by common use. It now stretched nearly 4 miles through the woods, marked only by the smallest signs, a line of stones, a circle of twine, a cross made of twigs. The deeper you walked, the quieter it got, not eerily so, but intentionally, as if each step stripped away a layer of noise, until all that remained was soul and breath. And at the end, as always, stood the original cedar, still holding his name, still standing watch, still asking the silent question no voice could ever phrase. What are you walking toward? It wasn't meant to be answered aloud. It wasn't meant to be solved. It was meant to be lived, the way Elijah had lived it, the way so many now dare to follow. Lucia began receiving letters from people she had never met. Pilgrims, readers, viewers of a short documentary made by a young filmmaker who'd walked Elijah's trail and found himself unable to forget it. The letters weren't fan mail. They were confessions. One woman wrote, I didn't believe in God, but I believe in what he did. Another said, I haven't spoken to my son in 10 years. I'm walking the trail tomorrow. I want to leave that silence behind me. She started archiving these letters, placing them into a chest near the chapel's back room. On the lid, she wrote a single phrase burned into the wood, for those still walking. It became a ritual. Visitors dropped folded notes into the chest before leaving, like casting stones into still water, hoping, perhaps, that the ripples would reach farther than they could imagine. And somehow, they always seemed to. In one particularly moving instance, a man who had once served in the same military unit as Elijah showed up unannounced. He was older now, graying, his hands calloused and restless. He hadn't spoken of Elijah in over 30 years. But as he stood before the cedar, he placed a folded American flag at its base and whispered, You were always walking ahead of us, weren't you? Then he wept, not for loss, but for the revelation that even silence can be service. Lucia watched from a distance and wrote in her journal that night, Elijah did not walk away from us. He walked towards something we still fear. The place where God stops speaking words and starts speaking in wind, in root, in ache. He did not vanish. He listened. That entry, though never published, spread in whispers among the congregation. People began quoting it in their own prayers, writing it beside their names on the pilgrim cedar, passing it on in voice and spirit. Elijah's silence, once feared, had become a language, one that said, "Keep walking, even when you don't know the way." Especially then, as the years quietly passed, Elijah's way became more than a trail. It became a symbol for anyone who had ever felt called away from the noise of life, towards something quieter, deeper, unseen. People who had never met, never shared a language or culture, arrived with the same longing, not to find where Elijah had gone, but to understand why they, too, were drawn toward a place where answers didn't matter as much as presence. Among them was a woman named Sophia, a former opera singer who had lost her voice after a tragic accident. She came not expecting healing, but simply to walk. At the ridge, where the trail ends and the view opens to the valley, she sat for hours in silence. When she returned to the chapel, she wrote in the visitor's book, "I thought I'd come here to find my voice again, but I found something better. I found I didn't need it to be whole." Her words would later be carved into a bench beneath the tree. Elijah's impact grew quietly. No press tours, no best-selling books, just stories passed from soul to soul like lanterns in the dark. In a quiet ceremony, Hollow Creek established the Walk of Names, a long wooden wall at the edge of the forest where people could etch initials, symbols, or prayers, not to be remembered by others, but to mark the moment they chose to keep going. It was never publicized, but names kept appearing. Thousands, weather-worn and beautiful. Lucia, now in her final years, spent her mornings watching the light filter through the trees, journaling as she always had. Her final entries were brief, written with a hand no longer steady, but a spirit clearer than ever. One read, "He walked in the woods and left a path through all of us. We did not lose him. We found ourselves." That sentence, later discovered by one of her caretakers, was printed and gently placed inside Elijah's old Bible, now resting in a glass case beside the pulpit. The chapel itself remained untouched by time, not in structure, but in soul. Every floorboard creaked with memory. Every pew held someone carrying something unspeakable, and yet none of it felt heavy, because Elijah's story had transformed their silence into sanctuary. His absence had taught them how to remain present, and his carved name on that tree had become more than remembrance. It had become invitation. On the 100th anniversary of Elijah Moore's birth, Hollow Creek did not hold a celebration. They held a walk, just as he would have wanted. Hundreds gathered at dawn, from nearby towns and faraway countries. Some barefoot, some leaning on canes, all silent. Together, they stepped onto the path he once walked alone, past the stones, past the ridge, through the hush that now carried his presence in every rustling leaf and sunbeam cutting through the mist. At the cedar, each person placed a candle at its roots. No speeches, no music, only stillness, layered with memory. Then, one by one, they turned to the person beside them and spoke a name, not Elijah's, but someone they were walking for. A mother, a friend, a stranger, a version of themselves. And in that quiet naming, Elijah's story folded into theirs. His trail, once a mystery, had become a mirror. That evening, as dusk settled and the final candle flickered out, a child asked, "Will he ever come back?" An elder nearby smiled and replied, "He already did. Every time someone takes one more step when they don't know the way, he's there." And somehow, the child understood. She turned and walked a little farther into the trail, her tiny footsteps joining a century of quiet courage. Later, beneath the starlit sky, the chapel bell rang twice, the signal that had come to mean remembrance. Then, unexpectedly, a third chime followed. No one moved to explain it. No one needed to. It was as if the trail itself had answered, not with words, but with return. And so, Elijah Moore's legacy lives, not in books, not in buildings, not in sermons, but in those who keep walking. Through silence, through loss, through wonder, his path remains, carved in cedar and soul, inviting every weary traveler to trust the stillness, to step without certainty, and to believe, even when all is quiet, they are not walking alone. Though Elijah Moore had long since passed in a legend, his path remained refreshingly human. Visitors didn't arrive expecting visions or revelations. They came because something about his story felt unfinished, and yet somehow complete. It was the paradox that drew them. How a man could vanish so quietly, and yet leave a sound that still echoed in the hearts of thousands. There was no shrine, no cathedral, just bark, soil, and breath. Among the newer travelers was a boy named Evan, only 13, who had read about Elijah in a borrowed book. He begged his parents to take him to Hollow Creek. When they arrived, he walked the trail slowly, barefoot despite the frost, and left behind a journal entry in careful print. If he could walk into the unknown, maybe I can walk through being different. He didn't say what different meant. He didn't have to. The trail, like Elijah, understood. A woman named Sister Juliana came months later. She had spent 30 years inside the walls of her convent, quietly battling a crisis of faith she could never speak aloud. After completing the walk, she sat at the base of the cedar tree and wept, not from sorrow, but release. He didn't run from God, she whispered. He walked toward the silence where God had always been. That sentence found its way on hundreds of postcards sold quietly in a nearby bookstore. Not for profit, but for passing on. A new generation of Hollow Creek locals took it upon themselves to maintain Elijah's Way, not as caretakers of a tourist site, but as stewards of meaning. They repaired the signs only when absolutely necessary. They kept the trail rustic, imperfect. If you polish it too much, one of them said, you erase what he left. The trail taught that truth doesn't always arrive clean. It arrives earned, dusty, and wild. And still, new names appeared. On the pilgrim cedar, on the wall of names, on small stones carried into the woods, placed at the roots of trees or beside carved scripture. Elijah Moore had become the keeper of these names, not because he asked to be, but because he showed the world how to walk without knowing exactly where the road would end. That summer, a small international symposium gathered in Hollow Creek. Academics, spiritual leaders, artists, and trauma survivors came together not to debate, but to listen. They walked Elijah's Way in silence, then gathered at the chapel to share reflections. But something unexpected happened. No one wanted to speak first, not out of fear, but reverence. The hush that Elijah left behind still commanded presence. Finally, a rabbi from Argentina stood and said, in my tradition, we teach that silence can be divine, that the gaps between words are where God rests. Elijah didn't vanish. He became the silence we needed to hear. The chapel, already still, somehow grew quieter. There were tears. Not dramatic, not loud. Just soft, sacred understanding passed from gaze to gaze like firelight. The symposium ended not with a ceremony, but with a walk. They moved through the forest under the stars, lanterns lighting the way like small floating prayers. No destination, no instruction, only a shared commitment to carry Elijah's story, not as a legend to retell, but as a map to follow. One lantern carried a quote written by a young woman who had walked the trail 3 times. Some men leave footprints. He left space for others to begin. After the gathering, a child approached the pilgrim cedar with a question. Can a tree remember forever? A volunteer knelt beside her and answered, only if we keep walking. That response became a mural in a school library miles away, painted beneath a trail that stretched into the horizon. It showed Elijah's figure in the distance, not alone, but followed by silhouettes of all sizes and stories. Not in sorrow, in purpose. And so the silence of Elijah Moore continued to echo, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't need to say. He carved his name into a living thing, and then trusted the rest to time, to earth, to faith. And all these years later, people were still listening, not to a man who disappeared, but to the man who showed the world what it means to walk into the mystery and let others find themselves along the way. As the decades passed, Elijah Moore's trail remained untouched by commercial hands. No billboards, no gift shops, no guided tours with rehearsed histories. And that was precisely why it endured. The trail had become something sacred, not in the religious sense alone, but in the deeply human way, a space where grief could breathe, where questions were not met with answers, but with gentle permission to keep asking. A professor from Paris once visited and remarked that Elijah's Way was less a place more a philosophy. He wrote in his notebook, "Most people build legacy through presence. Elijah built it through absence, an elegant defiance of the ego." That phrase struck a chord, especially among young seekers who felt unseen in their own lives. Elijah, in vanishing, had taught them that you don't need to be famous to be unforgettable. You don't need to be loud to be eternal. Nearby, in the small bookstore run by locals, a modest collection of writings had grown, a blend of letters, journal entries, and visitor reflections. None of them authored by Elijah, but all inspired by him. The book had no title, just a leather cover with a single engraved line, "To those still walking." It sold out every season, not because of marketing, but because of need. Readers didn't come looking for a story. They came hoping to feel less alone in their own. Children were now growing up with Elijah's name woven into their lullabies. One folk song, sung around winter fires, told the tale of a man who walked into the hush where hope still grows. Its final verse ended with, "If ever you are lost and scared, step softly through the pine. His trail begins in silence, and soon it will be thine." Parents sang it with a kind of holy ache, knowing their children, too, would one day have to walk into the unknown. And so, what began as a disappearance became a path of return. Not for Elijah, but for every soul seeking something deeper than comfort, meaning. The trail didn't offer escape. It offered encounter with self, with the sacred, with the vast silence we so often try to drown. And Elijah? He remained not a figure in history, but a quiet force, shaping lives not through presence, but through permission. In the heart of winter, with snow blanketing Elijah's way, an old man named Caleb made the walk alone. He had waited years, carrying a guilt he had never spoken. On his final visit, he brought a folded letter he had written to Elijah decades before, but never mailed. His fingers trembling from age and cold, he placed it beneath the cedar tree, tucked gently under a stone. Then he sat and whispered, "You waited for me." Even now, no one witnessed the moment. And yet, a hiker the next day found Caleb's footsteps leading up to the tree and stopping there. Just stopping. There were no footprints turning back. Just that letter. No body. No trail of exit. Only stillness. The hiker, startled, brought the note to Lucia's successor at the chapel. She read it silently and closed her eyes. "He didn't vanish," she said. "He followed." The letter was never made public, out of respect. But its final line was later added to the chapel wall in gold leaf. "When the silence calls, answer. Not with words, but with your steps." That quote became the heartbeat of the community. Weddings were held in the chapel beneath it. Farewells, baptisms, private confessions, all beneath the truth Elijah had carved with his very life. Walk on. Eventually, Elijah's trail was added to national heritage maps, but only with one condition from the town: no advertising, no tourist buses, no souvenir shops. It would remain the way it had always been, a trail found not by GPS, but by longing, a place for the broken, the seekers, the ones too tired to pretend anymore, a trail for the ones who needed to stop speaking and start listening. And so, generation after generation, Elijah's name remained carved in cedar, not fading, but deepening, not eroded, but echoing. He never returned in body. He didn't need to. Every step taken by someone who dared to trust the quiet, who dared to believe the unknown might still hold beauty, was a step he had already taken. Elijah Moore did not vanish. He became the way. In time, the small chapel at the trail's entrance began to be called the Listening Place. It wasn't official. There was no plaque or ribbon cutting. But the name stuck. Travelers who came from across the world spoke of how their minds quieted the moment they stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked with memory. The candlelight flickered, as if in sync with breath. There were no sermons, no choirs, just space to be. One man, a war veteran named Omar, came after losing his wife. He hadn't spoken to anyone in nearly 3 months. But when he entered the chapel, something inside him gave way. He knelt at the pew where Elijah once preached and whispered one word: "Guide." That night, he slept by the trailhead and dreamed of his wife's laughter echoing through the pines. When he woke up, it was snowing, but he felt warm. He stayed in Hollow Creek for 2 years, eventually becoming a trail keeper. Sculptors and artists began quietly honoring Elijah's legacy through their work, not with statues or grand portraits, but with small things. A hollowed walking stick with carved words along its spine. Even without a map, I walked. A quilt sewn from hundreds of scraps left by hikers who camped near the trail. A stained glass window gifted to the chapel, showing a lone figure walking into gold and shadow. Each piece whispered what Elijah had never said aloud. You are not lost. One day, a child born deaf traced her fingers across Elijah's name on the pilgrim cedar. She turned to her mother and signed. Did the tree hear him? The mother replied gently, the tree remembers. That moment, captured by a passerby, later became a painting known simply as Remembrance. It traveled to galleries around the world, not because of the artist's fame, but because people saw themselves in the silence it depicted. In every corner of Hollow Creek, traces of Elijah remained, not in the expected places, but in pauses, in breaths, in the quiet nods exchanged between strangers who had walked the same earth. It wasn't a story that ended. It was a story that began again. Every time someone chose stillness over noise, courage over comfort, surrender over certainty. One autumn, a group of students came to Elijah's Way as part of a literature class studying narratives of disappearance. They arrived skeptical, expecting folklore. But by the end of their hike, something had shifted. One of them, a girl named Yara, wrote in her journal, "This isn't about someone who vanished. It's about someone who became the road others walked to find themselves." Her professor later called it the most honest interpretation he'd ever read. Soon after, schools across the region began incorporating Elijah's story into their curriculum, not as history, but as emotional literacy. Students learned not just about the events of his life, but about silence, grief, choice, and meaning. Instead of exams, they were asked to write their own version of Elijah's Way, not a trail in the woods, but a personal journey through uncertainty. The responses were raw, real, and often healing. A filmmaker came to Hollow Creek hoping to make a documentary. But after 2 weeks, he deleted all his footage. The camera made it too clean, he said. Elijah's story lives in the moments you don't record. Instead, he wrote a short story titled The Footstep I Never Heard, inspired by the way hikers hesitated before stepping onto the trail, as if they knew they were entering something holy. The story became a quiet bestseller. Around the same time, a blind poet named Lena visited the trail with her guide dog. At the Cedar, she read from a Braille copy of her latest work. The final stanza read, "He is not a shadow. He is the shape of light. When you close your eyes and dare to follow anyway." Her voice trembled, but her presence was unwavering. That poem is now etched on a stone halfway through the trail, right at the point where most visitors begin to cry, though they don't always know why. And so, Elijah's name, once a simple carving on bark, had become the beginning of 1,000 stories. His disappearance did not mark an end. It ignited a movement, one where silence was not feared, but followed, where the unknown wasn't an enemy, but a companion, and where every weary soul who stumbled into Hollow Creek could hear, in their bones, the unspoken invitation, walk. Even now, the town of Hollow Creek never grew much in size, but its heart expanded beyond what any map could show. People began to say that it wasn't really a town anymore. It was a threshold, a place between noise and stillness, between the ache of the world and the comfort of something older. Visitors didn't come to sightsee. They came to shed, to lay down burdens too heavy to carry, in a place that didn't ask for explanations. A woman named Sienna came from Norway after reading a translated blog post about Elijah. She had lost her son the previous year and had spoken to no one since. The trail was icy when she arrived, almost dangerous in spots, but she walked it slowly, deliberately. At the Cedar, she didn't cry. She just sat and whispered a lullaby from her homeland. Later, she wrote in the guest book, "I couldn't bury him, but I gave him to the silence, and the silence held him." Stories like hers began to fill the walls of a modest shelter at the trailhead, built not for tourism, but for testimony. People left shoes, necklaces, notes folded into the seams of the bench cushions, a child's stuffed bear, a worn Bible, a faded wedding band. Nothing was cataloged, nothing was claimed, yet everything was kept. The room became known as the Quiet Archive, a place where grief and grace lived side by side without needing to speak. Young volunteers, some of whom had first arrived as visitors, began taking shifts tending to the trail, the chapel, the archive. They weren't paid. They didn't want to be. One of them, a teen named Marcus, said it best. "I came here thinking I was lost. But maybe I was just paused. Elijah taught me how to press play again." His words were later stitched into the lining of the guest robes used by pilgrims during colder seasons. And yet, despite the quiet, despite the absence of spectacle, the story kept growing. Not because of virality, but because of viscerality. Elijah's way was now etched not only in cedar and stone, but in lungs, in choices, in second chances. The trail did not promise answers. It offered presence. And for many, that was the most sacred thing of all. As the centennial of Elijah Moore's disappearance approached, Hollow Creek prepared, not for a celebration, but for a return. Not his, of course, but a return to the intention behind his steps. A time to reflect on what it meant to disappear with purpose. Instead of planning events, the town issued a simple request to the world. On this day, wherever you are, take one quiet step forward in his name. The response was overwhelming. Videos began surfacing of people walking silently through forests, deserts, cities, backyards, each of them carving, in their own way, a version of Elijah's trail. A nurse in Tokyo walked the hospital corridors after a shift, whispering prayers for each patient. A mechanic in Nairobi walked to the graveside of his brother, holding a piece of wood with Elijah's name scratched in. A child in New Zealand walked in circles around a tree, saying nothing, but smiling the entire time. Back in Hollow Creek, hundreds gathered at dawn. But this time, no one walked the trail. Instead, they formed a circle around the chapel, held hands, and stood in total silence for exactly 26 minutes. One for each year Elijah had been missing before his name was found carved into the cedar. The silence was deep, healing, and when the final minute passed, no one moved. It was as if the world itself had paused to exhale. Later that night, a new carving was quietly added to the opposite side of the pilgrim cedar. No one admitted to making it. It simply appeared, as if placed by time itself. It read, "You do not walk alone." Those 5 words became the mantra of a generation that had never met Elijah, but had been forever marked by his absence, and by what that absence had made possible. Because in the end, Elijah Moore did not lead people to himself. He led them back to their own hearts, to their pain, to their hope, to the sacred trail between question and peace. His story was never about a man who disappeared. It was about what happens when we dare to follow the kind of silence that does not abandon, but invites. With Elijah's story now woven into the fabric of Hollow Creek's identity, a new tradition emerged, the Whispering Walks. These were gatherings held during the quiet hours of dawn, where people would walk Elijah's way in complete silence. No talking, no music, only the sound of footsteps and breath. It was a way to honor not only Elijah's journey but the countless unseen journeys that mirrored his own, those of loss, searching, and finally, surrender. One such walk attracted a diverse crowd, artists, scientists, clergy, and wanderers, all drawn by the call of something intangible. Among them was a poet named Maya, who later wrote, "The trail is less a place to find Elijah and more a place to find the silence within ourselves. The silence that holds all our stories, pain, and hopes without judgment." Her words spread quickly, encouraging many to approach the trail not as a destination, but as a practice, a sacred pause in life's chaos. At the chapel, a small gallery was dedicated to reflections inspired by Elijah's way. Paintings of trees, abstract sculptures of footsteps, and handwritten letters filled the space. Visitors were invited to contribute, transforming the gallery into a living, breathing testament to the trail's ongoing impact. One painting, titled The Silent Guide, depicted a figure dissolving into a forest of glowing paths, an image that captured the essence of Elijah's legacy, presence in absence. Meanwhile, the pilgrim cedar stood firm, its bark thickening with age. Scientists marveled at its resilience, noting how it thrived despite harsh winters and storms. Locals saw it as a metaphor, the strength to endure, to grow, even when battered by time and elements. It became a symbol not only of Elijah, but of every person who carries scars unseen yet refuses to be broken. And every year, on the anniversary of Elijah's disappearance, the community gathered beneath that tree. They shared stories, lit candles, and listened. Not for answers, but for the sacred hum of continuity, proof that some voices, once whispered into the wind, echo forever in the hearts of those who dare to listen. The final chapter of Elijah's story is not found in a book or plaque, but in the footsteps of those who continue to walk his path. A young woman named Lila, once lost in doubt, credits her first healing to Elijah's trail. A man named Daniel found peace from his warm memories after sitting for hours in the chapel silence. A child named Emma traced Elijah's name on the cedar with small fingers, promising to come back when she was older. These lives, and thousands more, are living testaments to a story that never truly ends. In the quiet of the woods, where light filters softly through the leaves, Elijah's name remains carved into living bark. It is worn, weathered, and yet unmistakable, a silent call to all who come searching, not to find him, but to find themselves. Because Elijah did not vanish to escape, he vanished to reveal a deeper truth, that sometimes the greatest journey is the one into silence. And so, as you watch this, wherever you are, consider this. What path are you walking? What silence are you afraid to enter? Elijah's story invites you not to run from the unknown, but to walk toward it, with courage, with faith, and with the understanding that even in silence, you are never truly alone. Elijah Moore's story teaches us that sometimes the most profound journeys are not marked by grand gestures or loud declarations, but by quiet steps into the unknown. His disappearance was never an end, but a beginning, a call to listen deeply, to walk with faith even when the path is unseen, and to trust that silence holds its own truths. Throughout this story, we've learned that presence can transcend absence, and that sometimes the greatest legacy is the space we leave for others to find their way. As we reflect on Elijah's path, we are reminded that life's unanswered questions are not failures to be feared, but invitations to grow. It challenges us to reconsider what it means to disappear, to withdraw not in defeat, but in surrender, to vanish not in loss, but in transformation. Elijah's carved name in the cedar is more than a memorial. It is a beacon for all who seek courage to step beyond comfort and face the wilderness within and without. This story resonates because it mirrors a universal truth. We all carry moments of uncertainty, silence, and waiting. Elijah's journey urges us to embrace those moments as sacred, to understand that the unknown is not empty, but pregnant with possibility. His legacy is a whisper in the wind telling us that even in our quietest, loneliest hours, we are part of a greater story, one that unfolds not in isolation, but in the shared courage to continue walking. If Elijah's story moved you, if it stirred something deep inside, remember that you, too, have a path worth walking, even when the way is unclear. Here, in this space, we honor those journeys. So if you want to explore more stories that touch the unseen and inspire the brave, join our community by subscribing to the channel. Your presence here means more than you know, and your voice matters. Feel free to share in the comments what part of Elijah's journey resonated most with you. And if you believe this story deserves to reach others searching for hope in silence, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes a single story is all it takes to remind us that no one truly walks alone, even when the trail disappears into the quiet woods.